After Mitzi Gaynor passed away quietly in her sleep, her longtime Beverly Hills residence, nestled off a shaded cul-de-sac just above Coldwater Canyon, went on the market for the first time in decades. Real estate agents described the property as classic Hollywood elegance, a 1960s modern with walls of glass, vintage lighting, and panoramic views of the canyon. But those who had known Mitzi personally remembered how she had refused to let certain rooms be touched or remodeled, especially her private dressing room, which remained exactly as it was in the 1980s. Perfume bottles on mirrored trays, a faded photo of her late husband, and a faint smell of her favorite Chanel No. 5 still lingered long after her death. The house sat for nearly a year before a young couple from Chicago, Michael and Laura Greaves, purchased it. They were newly married, both in their early 30s with no children. He was an up-and-coming screenwriter, drawn to the Hollywood legacy of the property. She had a background in interior design and fell in love with the mid-century details. They intended to do only light renovations, just enough to modernize the kitchen and update the bathrooms. But things began to feel wrong almost immediately after they moved in. On their third night in the home, Laura woke around 3:14 a.m. to the sound of soft humming. She thought Michael had left the TV on in the other room, but the house was completely dark. The sound, distant and melodic, reminded her of an old musical, slow, feminine, and almost wistful. It stopped as soon as she stepped into the hallway. The next morning, she noticed something odd in the dressing room. One of the mirrors, the large round one in the corner vanity, seemed to glow faintly at night. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a reflection from outside. But it continued night after night. Sometimes the mirror would fog slightly, as if someone had breathed on it, though there was no warmth, no source of condensation. Once, she even found a small lipstick stain on the glass, shaped like a kiss. She hadn't touched that mirror. Michael was skeptical when she told him. "It's just the age of the place," he said. "The wiring, the glass, it's an old house." But even he began to notice things. The faint smell of perfume in the hallway at night. A shadow that moved past the frosted glass of the bathroom door. The stereo turning on by itself, always to songs from the 1950s or early 60s. Once, he heard the unmistakable sound of tap shoes on tile. They joked about it at first. "Mitzi's still here," Laura would say. But soon, the joke stopped being funny. The trouble really began when Laura decided to remodel the dressing room. She had been careful with the rest of the house, preserving original fixtures, even hiring a preservation consultant. But the dressing room, with its dated wallpaper and pale pink carpet, felt too fragile, too trapped in time. She brought in a small crew to remove the built-in vanity and pull up the flooring. On the first day of demolition, one of the workers, a local handyman named Curtis, quit abruptly after working only 2 hours. He claimed he had seen an elderly woman in the hallway watching him work. "She looked right at me," he said, "like she was disappointed." That same day, the power flickered repeatedly. Michael, who was in his office downstairs, lost 2 hours of script work to a sudden crash on his computer, something he later couldn't replicate. The night after the vanity was removed, Laura heard sobbing. She followed the sound to the empty dressing room, where it stopped the moment she turned on the light. In the silence that followed, she noticed a faint imprint on the carpet, the outline of a woman's heels, pressed into the fabric as if someone had been sitting at the vanity for a long, long time. The next morning, all of the old vanity pieces, which had been stacked in the garage, were shattered on the floor. No one heard a crash. Laura stopped the renovation. Over the next few weeks, the energy in the house shifted. Doors opened slowly on their own. The hallway would go ice cold, especially near the built-in record cabinet. Laura became more withdrawn, often staring out the window or into the darkened mirror in the dressing room. She began dressing in vintage clothing she found in storage trunks left behind, gowns from the 70s, silk robes. When Michael commented on it, she simply said she felt closer to the house that way. One night, she didn't come to bed. Michael found her in the dressing room, sitting in the dark in front of the empty mirror. She was humming. He put his hand on her shoulder. She flinched. "I was trying to remember the lyrics," she said. "To, I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair." She liked that one, I think. Michael checked her phone history later and found dozens of searches related to Mitzi Gaynor, her films, her shows, her life. She had been watching South Pacific, and there's no business like show business on loop. But the strangest part? Lara never liked musicals. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. June arrived heavy and breathless in the canyon. The jacarandas along the narrow street behind the Greaves home had bloomed into a violent purple, their petals scattering across the pavement like bruises. Inside the house, the air had changed. Not in temperature, the HVAC system still hummed. A quiet, dependable rhythm, but in tone. The light that came through the tall windows was paler now, almost silver, and dust no longer settled in the usual corners. It moved, instead, in strange vertical columns, like stage spotlights that shifted even when no one passed through. Michael had grown quieter. His screenplay, a period drama about an aging actress losing her grip on reality, remained unfinished, gathering virtual dust on his laptop. He had stopped writing altogether after a peculiar incident in the upstairs den. He'd been seated at his desk, trying to focus, when he heard a faint knock behind him. Not on the door, on the window. The house sits high above the canyon, with no balcony on that side. The window looked out over a 50-foot drop into foliage and rocks. But still 3 soft knocks. He turned quickly. Nothing there. And yet the knock repeated. Faint, rhythmic, almost polite. He approached the glass and peered out, seeing nothing but the reflection of the room behind him, lit golden by a single lamp. But as he looked closer, his own reflection shifted and became layered with something else. A face. A woman's face, not quite superimposed on his, but just behind his shoulder. Hair curled at the ends, lips parted as if mid-song. He stumbled back so fast he knocked over the chair. Downstairs, Lara had started playing records she hadn't bought. One of them Mitzi sings. She found in a cabinet that neither of them had explored. It had been behind a sliding panel in the dining room wall, concealed behind an old wall sconce with a broken bulb. She played that album the most, sometimes several times a day, letting it spin on the vintage console turntable that came with the house. She didn't seem to notice how the song sometimes slowed when she passed by, how the singer's voice would drag, then warble, then just briefly seem to change key in the middle of a line. Michael noticed. One evening, he watched Lara standing in the center of the living room, barefoot, wearing a silk dressing gown she had pulled from a long-forgotten cedar trunk in the attic. She was humming along with the record, but her lips weren't quite matching the song. It took him a few seconds to understand she wasn't singing with the track. She was singing ahead of it, as if she knew what was coming before it played. When he called her name, she didn't answer. Not even a flinch. Her eyes were fixed on the middle distance, right where the glass wall looked out into the night-black canyon. It was around this time that neighbors stopped visiting. At first, it was subtle canceled dinner invitations, polite reschedules that never materialized. Then came the more awkward moments. An elderly woman from the house across the street, who had once brought Lara homemade banana bread and shared stories about seeing Mitzi walking her little dog back in the day, stopped waving. One afternoon, she even turned away abruptly when she saw Lara outside pruning the rose bushes. "I heard music late again," another neighbor said once, his voice low, careful. "Do you host events? I thought I saw cars." There had been no events. No cars. Michael checked the security footage. Nothing. Just static bursts between 2:12 and 2:35 a.m. every night. Then came the performance. It was a Wednesday evening. Fog had rolled in unusually thick, blanketing the hills with a strange hush. The house, with all its windows and glass doors, seemed to glow faintly in the gray mist. Michael came downstairs around midnight to get a glass of water. The record player was on again. Softly playing an instrumental, he recognized the melody from Anything Goes. He meant to shut it off, annoyed, but as he turned the corner into the living room, he froze. Lara was standing on the coffee table, not dancing, performing. She held a makeup brush in one hand like a microphone, her other arm stretched out as though beckoning to a crowd, her head tilted back with dramatic precision. She wasn't singing in her own voice. It was brighter, theatrical old-school Broadway diction, filled with vibrato. It wasn't an impression. It was something else. But the worst part, the absolutely strangest part, was the clapping. Soft, faint, but real. Applause from nowhere. Michael walked backward into the hallway, trembling. Then he noticed the photos. They had appeared overnight. 8x10s. Glossy black and white stills, framed in thin brass, neatly arranged in a new gallery wall along the stairs. Mitzi in her prime, dancing, laughing, sitting in a director's chair, looking over her shoulder at the camera. They had not been there the night before. Laura claimed she didn't put them up, that she didn't know where they came from, but she never asked for them to be taken down. There is more. There is always more in a house like this one that had lived longer than its owner, that had absorbed every applause, every footstep, every solitary sob in front of a mirror that never quite let go. But something had changed in Laura now. Her posture, her cadence, even her handwriting in the grocery list on the fridge had a retro flair. Cursive loops, old-school abbreviations. Michael had started sleeping in the guest room. He told himself it was because of the renovations, because of the late-night noise. But deep down he was afraid. Not of the house, not of Mitzi. He was afraid that soon he wouldn't recognize the woman he had married. The guest room where Michael had been sleeping was the smallest in the house. It faced the street, not the canyon, a detail that comforted him in ways he didn't care to examine too deeply. There were no long panes of black glass here, no echo of wind against the hillside, just the closed blinds and the slow tick of the vintage clock on the dresser. Even so, he rarely slept. Most nights, he lay stiff on the edge of the mattress, fully clothed, listening. It wasn't the creaks or thumps that unnerved him. Old houses made noise. It was the music, always the music, not loud, just beneath hearing, like a memory playing at the edge of consciousness. Jazz standards, Broadway choruses, the occasional bar of something orchestral and grand. Sometimes he could swear he heard applause again, sometimes whispering, but most often, it was humming tuneless now, and slow, like someone half remembering a song they once knew by heart. He would press his head into the pillow and hold his breath, praying it would stop. It never did. On a particularly windless Friday afternoon, he decided to investigate the storage room in the basement. He hadn't been down there since their first week when they were still full of plans and energy, before the house had begun to feel too large for them. It was meant to be his writing den eventually, or maybe a screening room. The basement was cool, built partially into the slope of the hill, with thick concrete walls and a single exposed beam running the length of the ceiling. At the far end was a locked door. The key had been in the kitchen drawer this whole time, an unlabeled brass thing with a delicate neck, almost decorative. He remembered Laura finding it early on and saying, half-jokingly, "Some secrets belong to the house." At the time, it made them laugh. Now the words rang hollow. He opened the door with effort. The hinges moaned. The room inside smelled of dry paper and perfume turned stale. It was dark even after he flicked the switch. One flickering bulb cast a cone of yellow light over the space, revealing a low shelf lined with storage boxes and dusty portfolios. But what caught his attention first was the wall opposite the entrance. Photographs, dozens of them, taped, pinned, some framed, some curling at the edges. Mitzi Gaynor in every stage of her life. Glamour shots from her early years. Candid Polaroids laughing with friends. Drinking from a chipped wine glass on a pool chaise. Tour posters, playbills, letters. But more than anything, mirrors. There were 6 of them, each different. One had a Baroque gold frame. Another was perfectly circular with beveled edges. Some were cracked. One was covered with a veil of black cloth. He didn't dare remove it. And in the middle of the room, set carefully on a velvet stool, was a tape recorder. Old-fashioned, the kind with big square buttons and worn leather casing. Michael approached it slowly, feeling a familiar chill press against his neck as he bent down to examine it. There was a cassette inside, labeled, in handwritten script, Audition, 1973, Private Cut. He hesitated only a second before pressing play. The tape crackled, then a low hum. Then, unmistakably, Mitzi's voice. Not speaking. Singing. Live, raw, unpolished. It wasn't a recording he'd heard anywhere online. Not on YouTube. Not on the fan forums he'd checked, searching for some explanation in those early restless nights. This was something else personal. Intimate. Her voice was trembling slightly, the sound of a woman past her prime but fighting like hell not to let go of it. It was powerful, full of longing. And as he listened, something in the air around him shifted. The light bulb above flickered once, then steadied. The mirror with the gold frame began to fog. And just as the final note of the song echoed from the tape, he heard something behind him. A sigh. Soft, disappointed, and far too close. Michael backed out of the room without turning off the tape. He locked the door behind him. Not because he thought it would keep anything in, he wasn't that naive anymore, but because he needed to believe he had drawn a line. That there were still boundaries left in the house. That night, Lara didn't come down for dinner. He brought a tray up around 10. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, light spilling out into the hall. He stepped inside. She was standing in front of the long mirror on the closet door. Perfect posture. Her makeup done immaculately, with a classic red lip and the exact shade of blue shadow Mitzi used to wear during her Vegas years. She wore a champagne-colored dress sequined, floor-length one he didn't recognize. She was practicing her smile. Not just any smile. Mitzi's smile. The camera-ready, slightly coy expression, with just a tilt of the head and narrowed eyes. Michael had seen it in hundreds of photos now. On magazine covers. In the basement. Lara turned toward him. Slowly. Her lips moved. "Do you think they'll want an encore?" she asked. Her voice wasn't quite hers. It was brighter, breathier, pitched higher than usual, with a forced charm that didn't belong in the present. Michael didn't speak. Couldn't. Because in the reflection behind her, barely visible in the far curve of the mirror's edge, was another woman. Faded. Watching. The house, by early August, had quieted in a way that was no comfort. The music still came, but it no longer felt like a haunting. It was part of the structure now, a low and persistent hum in the walls, a breath in the vents, a string section warming up in the pipes. The air carried it, even when there was silence. Especially then. Michael barely left his room anymore. Not out of fear, not exactly, but because there was nothing left to reason with. The house had chosen its lead. And it wasn't him. Lara no longer responded to her name unless it was delivered with applause. She now insisted on being called Mitzi. Not with humor, not with irony, but with gravity, like it had always been her. Her wardrobe had shifted entirely. She wore chiffon robes in the morning, rhinestones at noon, false lashes by dinner. She moved through the house with the languid grace of someone preparing for a show that never truly began, and yet she always seemed to be stepping off stage. He tried at first to pull her back. One morning, he held her by the shoulders, desperate, shaking slightly. "Lara," he said, "I want my wife back." She blinked at him with the wide, fixed eyes of a performer blinded by spotlight, then smiled softly, that awful perfect smile, and replied, "She gave her curtain call weeks ago, darling." Then she walked into the main hall and spun, arms out, as if greeting an invisible audience. On August 12th, Michael made the call. Not to the police, not to a doctor. He knew better. No one would believe him. He called Vincent Hirsch, a former stage technician and friend of Mitzi Gaynor's, now 91, living in a modest retirement home in Van Nuys. Vincent remembered the house well. "Oh, that place was always strange," he croaked through the phone. "She wouldn't let anyone stay past dark. Said the energy shifted after the sun went down. That the walls had memory. I thought she was just being dramatic. You know how actresses are." But then, toward the end, Michael waited. "She used to rehearse at night," Vincent said finally. "Alone. I saw her once 3 in the morning, fully dressed, performing for an empty room. Except it didn't feel empty. I swear to God, I heard clapping. Not canned applause. Real hands. Multiple pairs." Michael was silent. Vincent continued, quieter now. "She died in that house. Not officially, of course. Her heart gave out in the hospital. But something in her stayed there, left behind. She loved the stage too much to leave it even when the curtain came down. August 14th. The night it finally broke. Michael awoke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of heels on the hardwood floor above him, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone crossing a stage for a final bow. He got out of bed and moved through the hallway in a daze. The air was thick, humid with perfume and heat. Every bulb in the house seemed dimmer than usual, casting golden pools that flickered as he passed through them. He found her in the sunken living room, beneath the high-beamed ceiling and the row of mounted stage lights that had never worked until now. They flickered to life one by one, bathing the room in theatrical brilliance. Laura Mitzi stood in the center, arms outstretched. Her gown shimmered silver blue. Her face was turned upward, basking in a light that wasn't entirely of this world. She began to sing. Not the Mitzi songs he had grown used to. Not anything he'd heard on vinyl or cassette or in the rehearsal room below. This song was new or ancient. It had no melody at first, just a keening sound that rose in waves. Then it swelled into lyrics. A ballad, tragic, beautiful, a farewell soaked in longing. She sang it to someone not in the room, or not entirely visible. And then, behind her, the mirrors lit up. All 6 dragged from the basement and placed around the room at some point without Michael noticing, reflected not one woman, but many. Not just Laura, not just Mitzi, but versions of her in stage makeup, in mourning veils, in a 1950s pantsuit, in a 1980s sequin blazer. Each moved in time with her, not as reflections, but as performers in a final ensemble. And then came the audience. Not seen, only heard. Dozens of voices. Applause. Cheers. A standing ovation from the void. Michael fell to his knees. He began to cry, not from fear anymore, but from something deeper. A grief he couldn't name. It wasn't for the woman he'd lost. It was for the idea of permanence. For the illusion that houses die with their owners. That memories fade. That echoes vanish. Because here in this house they didn't. In the morning the house was silent. No music. No applause. No humming. Michael found Laura asleep on the living room rug, still wearing the gown. Her face streaked with glitter and tears. The stage lights were dead. He carried her upstairs like a child, laid her down gently, sat at her side for hours. When she finally woke, her voice was hoarse. She looked at him and asked, "What happened?" He didn't answer. He just whispered, "It's over." But he knew it wasn't. Not really. 6 weeks later, the house went back on the market. Laura insisted on it. She was herself again mostly, but there were blank spots in her memory, days she didn't recall. She claimed the stage lights had always worked. She remembered none of the tapes, none of the photos. She had taken to sleeping with the windows open. She said the house was too quiet now. Michael moved out before the listing hit Zillow. He didn't leave a forwarding address. Final entry Zillow review, left anonymously. The property is visually stunning. The views are incredible. But something lingers there like perfume in an empty room. The walls are too quiet when you're alone, and too loud when you're not. I saw my wife disappear inside that house. She came back, but someone else stayed. Maybe more than one. If you're not in show business, I'd recommend looking elsewhere. Some stages never go dark. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.